This chapter covers public opinions on crime, as well as media and crime. In general, the public sees crime as a serious problem. People see crime as being rampant, that there are a lot of crimes happening, that people are at a high risk of victimization, etc. And people think that there's just too much crime. Some reasons people have these beliefs are because of media and TV portrayals of crime. The comic pictured here shows a media news station, and out front of the building a person is running away from another person with a purse, appearing to have robbed the other person. The news media has a bubble stating, "Street crime. Wherever we look, all we see is street crime." But on top of the building shows a representation of corporate crime with a person sitting on bags full of money. And this illustrates that the media's preoccupation with violent or street crimes as opposed to other types of crimes, such as white-collar crimes. And not surprisingly, the media portrays crime as being worse or more prevalent than it is. And that is, the media over-dramatizes crime. I'll explain what that means in more depth momentarily. It is possible that news stations just want to capture the attention of the audience so that they have more viewers, and not necessarily because they intend to influence people's views on crime, although they do. So now we're going to cover the ways that media over-dramatizes crime. Way number one that media over-dramatizes crime is through making it seem like there is a crime wave happening. Even though the media coverage of crime is generally heavy, the U.S. is actually in a time of declining or at least stable rates of crime. Of course, the trends in crime vary slightly by the type of crime being examined, but by and large, crime rates have declined substantially since the 1990s. But media reports of crime don't necessarily reflect that, though. For example, the public generally thinks that school shootings have been on the rise because it is more publicized by the media. But there are some analyses that show violent deaths at schools have actually been stable in the U.S. since the 1990s. And estimates by the CDC suggest that between the 1990s and early 2010s, deaths at schools from homicides and suicides have hovered in a fairly stable pattern. And of course, how the term quote-unquote mass shooting is even defined can influence data patterns. But all in all, though, this is just to show that the way in which media reports crime does not necessarily always reflect true patterns of crime. A second way that the media over-dramatizes crime is by over-reporting crime, and especially violent crime. Essentially, the media just reports a ton of stories on crime and do not weigh the distribution of stories. That is, even though there are plenty of positive events happen, the media doesn't necessarily equally represent positive and criminal events. So crime stories lead the news, and there's an old saying about if it bleeds, it leads. Behind the weather and traffic, crime is the third-ranked type of story that is reported, especially violent crimes, even though most crimes that occur aren't violent crimes. And one of the issues with the over-dramatization is that media can perpetuate crime myths. A myth is a common belief that is often unproven or false. So crime myths are false beliefs about crime. Racial and ethnic minorities are often subjected to over-coverage in the media, in that the media covers more crimes committed by Black and Latino individuals, which leads the public to think that minorities engage in more crimes than whites. However, many crimes, especially drug crimes, are committed equally by minorities and non-minorities. And also, the media tends to focus on crimes that have a white victim, too. So the media over-exaggerates the involvement of minorities in crime and understates their victimization, which can perpetuate false beliefs about crime as they relate to race and ethnicity. As for social class, the media essentially fails to cover crimes committed by the upper class and focuses on crimes committed by lower class individuals, which leads viewers to think that social class is highly predictive of crime. And in fact, people in wealthier classes more frequently commit white-collar crimes. And regarding victimization, media tends to cover the victimization of people who are portrayed as completely innocent and of white people. So sometimes media tends to focus on white women or children being victimized, but in reality, those are not the people who are most likely to be victimized. In fact, the proportion of young, approximately 18 to 20-ish year olds, people of color who experience violent victimizations is higher than do the types of victims, white people, women, who are portrayed in the media. The focus on victims that aren't actually most likely to be victimized can create more fear in being victimized. Other problems in the way that media presents crime include presenting misleading pictures of common aspects of crime. So, for example, with violent crimes, the media tends to focus on violence between strangers, when really violence more commonly occurs between people who know each other. And so media can also be problematic in its presentation of crime because reporters and news stations can select people to interview that support the reporters and news stations' point of view. Additionally, media often neglects to report white-collar crimes. Another issue with the media portrayal of crime is the use of value-laden language. So as opposed to reporting facts and neutrally describing incidents, media outlets often use words that try to paint the alleged crime as being really heinous. But here, I'm going to focus on how the media can misrepresent data. So one example of media misrepresenting information is from the stand your gun laws enacted in Florida. And if you don't know, in the U.S., stand your ground laws state that an individual has no duty to retreat from a place that they have the right to be, and that they can use any level of force, including lethal, if they reasonably believe that they face serious threat of injury or death. So, the original figure that was presented by the news organization Reuters is pictured on the left. It counts the number of gun deaths in Florida and in relation to the stand your ground law. The number of gun deaths appears to rise and reach a peak in the 2000s, and then in 2005 when the stand your ground law was enacted. So it's common for people to interpret this as a decrease in the number of deaths, gun deaths, after stand your ground law was passed. However, if you look closely at the axis, the number of gun deaths are counted from the top being 0 to the bottom, 800. So therefore, the highest peaks are actually representing the fewest gun deaths. So, the second graph here, the graph on the right, flipped horizontally and vertically, paints the clearer picture that gun deaths increased after stand your ground was enacted. Another example of misrepresentation of data in media is the FBI's crime clock. So as described by the FBI, quote, "This representation of crime data shows the relative frequency of how often violent and property crime offenses occur." When this is presented, the media tends to suggest that this shows how often each type of crime occurs. Comparing the seconds from 2013 to 2016 to 2017 suggest that violent crime, for example, is happening more frequently. It suggests that a murder used to happen in 2013 every 37 minutes, but now in 2017, a murder occurs every 30 minutes. So this instills fear because it suggests that less time needs to pass for a violent crime to happen. However, this is problematic because the crime clock represents the annual ratio of crime to fixed time intervals. So the denominator in this calculation is time, which is a fixed number. So there are numerous problems with this because, for example, this doesn't take into account that the population in the U.S. has increased, so there are just more people in general that could commit a crime. So, presenting misleading data is just one example of the problems in media coverage, but some other things that I had mentioned were the use of value-laden language, the misrepresentation of the types of common aspects of crime, for example, knowing the offender or not, and neglecting white-collar crimes, for example. So these are all problems with media coverage. The media has numerous influences on the public. People may incorrectly believe facts about the amount of crime, trends in crime, etc. And so, public ignorance. One common myth today is that immigration increases crime, whereas in fact, numerous studies suggest immigration is associated with decreases in crime rates. And another consequence with the ways in which media presents crime is that media can neglect the link between social structure and crime. So people have a more individualistic view on the causes of crime and don't necessarily consider the broader social and structural forces of crime, such as social inequalities and neighborhood conditions. Additionally, the lack of reporting about white-collar crimes results in people thinking that upper-class people aren't involved in crime. And since the media tends to focus on minorities charged or convicted of crime, it can reinforce racial and ethnic stereotypes. Research suggests that Americans, including minorities and non-minorities, categorize blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans as violent, dangerous, and criminal. And the overrepresentation of minorities in media reports on crime can reinforce implicit biases that people hold that link minorities to negative attributes such as unpleasantness and dangerousness. Another effect of the media coverage on crime is the fear of crime. So many people feel threatened by crime victimization, especially by strangers. For example, in 2012, the General Social Survey had found that 33.7% of respondents are afraid to walk in their neighborhoods alone at night. And not surprisingly, people often take precautions to avoid victimization, like locking house doors, putting things in the trunk when they leave their car, etc. Having a fear of crime is linked to structural and individual factors. The things listed here are characteristics that are linked to having higher fear of crime. So, for example, those who are older generally have higher fear of crime, and so do females. This is particularly interesting because older people are less likely to be victimized than younger people, and women are less likely to be victimized than men. Fearing crime victimization is important because it has consequences such as weakened ties between community residents due to mistrusting others, which can lead to residential turnover. So public opinions on crime and responses to crime also can encompass the views on punitiveness or judgments about the appropriateness appropriateness of punishment for convicted criminals. And the public also tends to hold strong views about police and injustice in the criminal justice system. And so the media in general is therefore really influential for the public's views on crime and the criminal justice system. So this concludes Chapter 2.